The day she mocked my funeral dress, something inside me changed forever. The boutique fell silent, every eye turning to witness my humiliation. Her laughter sliced through the room like broken glass, followed by those cruel words, "You look dead already." What she didn't know then was that her mockery would awaken something in me that had been dormant for years, a fighting spirit that would eventually bring her empire crumbling down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I wasn't always Rebecca Mitchell, the woman who sued one of the most prominent fashion executives in Boston. Once, I was just Becca, a middle school art teacher with a closet full of paint-stained cardigans and a heart full of dreams I never dared to chase. My story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming worth, about standing up when the world expects you to stay small. And it begins in the most unlikely of places, a high-end boutique where I was shopping for a dress to wear to my father's funeral. Dad had passed suddenly from a heart attack, leaving behind a small woodworking shop, a collection of handcrafted furniture, and a daughter who wasn't prepared to say goodbye. We had always been close, especially after Mom died when I was in college. He was my anchor, my confidant, the person who taught me that kindness wasn't weakness, though I would later forget that lesson for a while. I had never been comfortable in upscale stores. With my teacher's salary and simple tastes, I usually shopped at department stores or thrift shops. But Dad's funeral felt different. I wanted to honor him with something special, something that showed the respect he deserved. So I stepped into Eloise Laurent's boutique on Newbury Street, a temple of fashion that intimidated me the moment I walked through its gleaming glass doors. The store smelled of expensive perfume and exclusivity. Sales associates with perfect makeup and judging eyes watched as I awkwardly browsed racks of clothing that cost more than my monthly rent. I felt out of place, but I persisted, eventually finding a modest black dress with delicate pearl buttons that reminded me of something my mother would have worn. When I emerged from the dressing room, uncertain but hopeful, I didn't expect to see Eloise Laurent herself standing there. She was a fashion icon in Boston, her boutique spreading across New England like carefully planted gardens of luxury. Her silver bob was cut with precision, her red lipstick perfectly applied, her gray eyes sharp and assessing. I had seen her in local magazines and news segments about women breaking barriers in business, but nothing prepared me for the casual cruelty of our first encounter. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice carrying through the store as she looked me up and down. "That dress isn't doing you any favors." She circled me slowly, like a predator. "What's the occasion? Please tell me you're not wearing this to a date." My voice was barely audible. "It's for my father's funeral tomorrow." Something flickered in her eyes, not compassion, but amusement. She turned to her assistant, a rail-thin woman with a permanent scowl. "Did you hear that, Vanessa? A funeral." Then she laughed, that terrible, hollow laugh that would echo in my nightmares. "Well, I hate to say it, but you look dead already in that. Perhaps that's fitting." The boutique went silent. A customer browsing nearby pretended to be fascinated by a silk scarf. The sales associate who had been helping me suddenly found something urgent to do in the back room. No one came to my defense. I stood there, humiliated, as tears threatened to spill. All I could think about was getting out, escaping the judgment and cruelty. I changed quickly, handed the dress to the embarrassed associate, and left without another word. That night, I cried myself to sleep, not just for my father, but for the shell of a person I had become. Someone who could be mocked publicly and would simply absorb it, accept it as deserved. In the morning, I wore an old black dress from my closet to Dad's funeral, feeling both underdressed and overlooked as I delivered his eulogy to a half-empty church. If this had been the end of my encounter with Eloise Laurent, perhaps nothing would have changed. I would have continued my quiet life, teaching art to middle schoolers, living in my small apartment with bookshelves made by my father, collecting moments of joy like seashells but never truly believing I deserved more. But fate had other plans. 3 months after Dad's funeral, I received a call from his attorney, a kind elderly man named Gerald Matthews, who had been Dad's friend since high school. "Rebecca," he said, his voice gentle but urgent. "There's something you need to know. About your father's estate. Can you come to my office tomorrow?" I had assumed there wasn't much to Dad's estate. His woodworking shop was successful but modest. The house had been sold after Mom died, and he'd been renting a small place near his workshop. What could possibly be so important? The next day, I sat in Gerald's cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of legal papers and the faint smell of pipe tobacco, as he revealed the truth that would change everything. "Your father," Gerald began, adjusting his reading glasses, "was more than just a woodworker, Rebecca. 27 years ago, he designed a unique joinery technique that he patented but never fully marketed. 5 years ago, he licensed this technique to Maison Laurent Furniture, a subsidiary of Eloise Laurent's company." My breath caught. "Laurent? As in—" "Yes, the same Eloise Laurent who owns those boutiques." Gerald shuffled some papers. "The contract stipulated significant royalties, which your father had been receiving. However, according to my review, for the past 2 years, those royalties have been substantially underpaid, despite Maison Laurent's expanded use of his technique in their luxury furniture line." The room seemed to tilt. "Are you saying she cheated my father?" Gerald chose his words carefully. "I'm saying there's a significant discrepancy between what the contract stipulates and what was paid. Your father noticed it about 6 months ago and asked me to look into it. I was preparing to address it when he passed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "How significant?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Based on my calculations and the sales figures we've obtained, the unpaid royalties amount to approximately $1, $8 million. The number hung in the air like an impossible dream. More money than I could imagine, owed to my father, owed to me now, and withheld by the woman who had humiliated me on one of the worst days of my life. "What do we do?" I asked, my hands trembling slightly. Gerald leaned forward. "Well, as your father's sole heir, you have options. We could send a formal letter demanding payment, attempt negotiation, or—" He paused, studying my face. "We could file a lawsuit." "A lawsuit?" The word felt foreign in my mouth. I had never sued anyone. I was the person who apologized when others bumped into me, who accepted less than I deserved because fighting seemed too confrontational. Yes, it would be public, potentially messy, but also potentially effective. Gerald removed his glasses. "Rebecca, your father was preparing to fight for what was rightfully his. He was a gentleman, but he understood the principle at stake. The question is, what do you want to do?" I thought about my father's hands, always steady, always creating something beautiful from raw materials. I thought about his quiet dignity, how he taught me to stand tall even when life tried to bend you. And I thought about Eloise Laurent's laugh, how easily she had dismissed me, how carelessly she had trampled on my grief. "I want what's right," I said finally, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I want what my father was owed." Gerald smiled, a small approving smile. "Then we'll need to prepare. This won't be easy, Rebecca. Eloise Laurent has resources, connections, and a reputation for being ruthless in business. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Was I ready? No, I was terrified. But something had shifted inside me that day in the boutique, a crack in the foundation of my self-doubt that had been slowly widening ever since. Maybe it was time to see what would grow in that space. "I'm sure," I said, straightening my posture. "Let's do it." What I didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that this decision would not only change my financial future, but would transform me from the inside out. That the woman who walked into Gerald's office that day, still grieving and uncertain, would emerge from this battle as someone entirely new. The lawsuit against Eloise Laurent was filed the following week. The local business papers picked it up immediately. Schoolteacher sues fashion mogul for $8 million in royalties dispute. I braced myself for the fallout, the scrutiny, the potential humiliation. What I wasn't prepared for was Eloise's response. Rather than settle quietly or address the legitimate claim, she went on the offensive. Her PR team released a statement, calling the lawsuit a desperate attempt by an unremarkable woman to extort money from a successful female entrepreneur. They suggested my father had been fairly compensated and that I was simply trying to cash in after his death. The cruelty was calculated, designed to make me back down. And it might have worked had I not received an unexpected visit the evening after the news broke. I was grading art projects at my kitchen table when there was a knock at my apartment door. Standing there was an elegant woman in her 60s with short gray hair and kind eyes. "Rebecca Mitchell?" she asked. "My name is Diana Winters. I used to work for Eloise Laurent. I think we should talk." Diana had been Eloise's business partner when they founded their first boutique 30 years ago. She told me, over cups of tea at my small kitchen table, how she had been gradually pushed out of the company as it grew. Her contributions minimized, her ownership stake diluted through legal maneuvering. "Eloise has a pattern," Diana explained, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting old pain. "She builds her success on other people's work, their creativity, their labor. And when they ask for fair recognition or compensation, she crushes them." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Diana smiled sadly. "Because someone needs to stand up to her, and because I have documents that might help your case." Those documents, old contracts, emails, accounting records that Diana had preserved, would become crucial evidence. But more important was the realization that I wasn't alone. Others had been hurt by Eloise's ruthless business practices. My fight was larger than just my father's royalties. It was about a pattern of exploitation that had gone unchallenged for too long. The next day, I called Gerald and told him about Diana's visit. "This changes things," he said thoughtfully. "With her testimony and these documents, we have a stronger case. But Rebecca, this also means Eloise will likely fight even harder. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my middle school students, how I always encouraged them to stand up against bullies, to support each other when someone was being mistreated. What kind of example would I be setting if I backed down now? "I'm prepared," I said, surprising myself with my resolve. "Let's keep going." And so began 18 months of legal battles that tested every ounce of my strength and resolve. Eloise's legal team was formidable, employing delay tactics, filing countersuit, and attempting to intimidate witnesses. The case dragged on, eating through my savings and forcing me to take a second job, tutoring on weekends to cover costs that would eventually be reimbursed if we won. A big if. There were dark moments when I questioned everything. Nights when I stared at my ceiling, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Days when I faced my students with eyes red from crying, trying to maintain a brave face while my life was being torn apart in the press. Eloise's PR campaign against me was relentless. They painted me as money-hungry, unqualified to understand business agreements, riding on my father's coattails. One particularly vicious article in a fashion blog described me as a small-town art teacher with delusions of grandeur who couldn't afford Eloise Laurent's designs, so decided to steal her money instead. The personal attacks were hardest to bear. Comments about my appearance, my career choice, my supposed motivations. Each one felt like a physical blow, reopening the wound of that day in the boutique when she had laughed at my funeral dress. But for every setback, there seemed to be an unexpected source of strength. My students created a "Ms. Mitchell is our hero" wall in the art room. Former employees of Eloise came forward with their own stories, emboldened by Diana's example. My small apartment became a meeting place for people who had been silenced by power and money but were finding their voices. Again, 6 months into the lawsuit, I received an offer to settle for $300,000, a fraction of what was owed. Gerald advised me to consider it. Trials are unpredictable, he warned, and this would be over. I thought about it. Truly I did. The money would have changed my life in meaningful ways. I could have paid off my student loans, maybe put a down payment on a small house, created some security for myself. The temptation to end the stress and uncertainty was powerful. But then I remembered my father's workshop, how he would never cut corners, never compromise on quality even when it would have been easier or more profitable. The things we make outlive us, he used to say. Make sure they tell a story you're proud of. I declined the offer. 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. I was shopping for groceries when my phone buzzed with a text from Gerald. Turn on Channel 7 now. I abandoned my cart and rushed to my car, turning on the radio to the local news station. Eloise Laurent had been arrested for tax fraud. An investigation, apparently ongoing for years but accelerated by the attention our lawsuit had brought to her business practices, had uncovered significant evidence of financial impropriety. The fashionable, untouchable queen of Boston's luxury market was being led away in handcuffs, her perfect image shattered. The case against her was separate from ours, but the implications were enormous. Her company's stock plummeted. Retailers began pulling her products from shelves, and suddenly, her legal team seemed far more interested in settling our claim. The next offer came in at $1. $5 million. Gerald called, excitement evident in his usually measured voice. This is a good offer, Rebecca. They're on the ropes, and they know it. We could push for the full amount, but that means more time, more stress. I sat with the decision for a full day, walking through my father's now empty workshop, running my hands over the tools he had used to create beautiful things. What would justice look like for him? What would healing look like for me? In the end, I countered with a different proposal. $1. $8 million, the full amount owed, with a public acknowledgement of my father's contribution to their furniture line, and a scholarship fund in his name for young woodworkers. To my shock, they accepted. The settlement was announced the following week, coinciding with Eloise's resignation from her company's board of directors. The woman who had once laughed at me was now facing her own public humiliation and potential prison time. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something more complex, a mixture of vindication, relief, and a strange kind of sadness for all the years and energy that had been consumed by this fight. But mostly, I felt free from doubt, from the fear that had kept me small for so long. The money changed my life, of course. I paid off debts, invested wisely, eventually bought a small house near my school with a detached garage. I converted into a woodworking studio where I spend my evenings creating pieces that blend my artistic sensibility with the techniques my father taught me. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was in the way I carried myself, the boundaries I learned to set, the conviction that my voice mattered. I continued teaching, turning down offers for books and speaking engagements. That would have taken me away from my students. Their art room remained my sanctuary, the place where I could help shape young minds to recognize their own worth early. So perhaps they wouldn't have to learn it the hard way, as I had. A year after the settlement, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Vanessa, Eloise's former assistant who had witnessed my humiliation that day in the boutique. I've wanted to reach out for so long, she wrote, to apologize for not speaking up when Eloise was cruel to you. I was trapped in a toxic workplace, terrified of losing my job. But that's no excuse. Watching you stand up to her gave me the courage to finally leave. I'm now designing my own clothing line with a focus on inclusive sizing and ethical production. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like. Her letter was one of many I received from people who had been touched by the case in ways I never anticipated. Former employees, other designers whose work had been appropriated, even customers who had witnessed similar behavior in Eloise's boutiques, all finding their own healing in the public reckoning that followed. As for Eloise, she eventually pled guilty to reduced charges and served 14 months in a minimum security prison. Upon her release, she moved away from Boston, her empire significantly diminished. I never spoke to her directly, never received an apology. I didn't need one anymore. Sometimes I think about that day in the boutique, how a moment of casual cruelty became the catalyst for profound change. How her words, "You look dead already," had inadvertently awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. The last time I saw my father alive, he was in his workshop, carefully sanding the edges of a rocking chair he was making for a new grandbaby in his best friend's family. I remember how the sunlight came through the dusty windows, illuminating his focused expression, his steady hands. The thing about wood, he told me, not looking up from his work, is that it seems so solid, so unchangeable. But with the right tools and enough patience, you can shape it into something entirely new. People are like that too, Becca. More flexible than they appear, capable of becoming something different than what they started as. At the time, I nodded politely, not understanding the depth of what he was saying. Now, standing in my own workshop, running my fingers over the grain of a piece of maple that will become a writing desk for one of my former students, I finally get it. We are all works in progress, constantly being shaped by the tools of experience, by loss and love, by humiliation and vindication. The grain of who we are remains, but the form can change dramatically. And sometimes, it takes someone underestimating you, looking at you and seeing only what you've been, not what you could become, to catalyze that transformation. The lawsuit changed me, yes, but not into someone new, into someone I was always meant to be, someone who stands tall, who speaks up, who creates beautiful things without apology, someone who knows her worth isn't determined by others' perceptions, someone who is very much alive. If you're watching this and feeling small, feeling overlooked or underestimated, I want you to know there is power in standing up, in refusing to accept less than you deserve. It may not happen overnight. It may be the hardest thing you've ever done. But on the other side of that fight is a version of yourself you haven't met yet, stronger, clearer, more alive than you can imagine. And trust me, she's worth fighting for. Before the lawsuit, before the settlement, before I became the woman who stood up to Eloise Laurent, I was simply Becca, a woman who apologized for existing. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow awakening, a gradual reclaiming of power that began long before I ever stepped into a courtroom. My story with Eloise may have started in that boutique, but the roots of my invisibility stretched back much further. I grew up in a small town outside of Boston, raised by parents who valued humility above all else. "Don't draw attention to yourself," my mother would say, smoothing my unruly hair before school. "Nice girls blend in." My father, though loving, reinforced this in his own way. "Just do good work," he'd tell me. "Let it speak for itself." And so I learned to take up less space in the world, to lower my voice, to hedge my opinions with maybe and I think, and I could be wrong, but I became an art teacher because I loved watching others find their voice through creativity, even as my own remained whispered. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could stand before a classroom of middle schoolers and passionately defend the importance of self-expression, yet shrink when a cashier gave me the wrong change. I could inspire students to create bold, boundary-pushing art, yet opt for neutrals in my own wardrobe to avoid standing out. This contradiction defined me until that day in Eloise's boutique, and even after, during those first disorienting months following my father's death. Grief has a way of both sharpening and blurring your edges. I moved through my days like a ghost, teaching my classes, grading projects, occasionally meeting friends for coffee I barely tasted. The world felt muted, as if someone had turned down the color saturation on my life. My apartment became both sanctuary and prison. I'd spend evenings sorting through Dad's belongings, which had been moved into my spare room after his death. Boxes of tools I didn't know how to use, stacks of woodworking magazines with pages dog-eared, photo albums from when our family was still whole, before Mom's cancer took her when I was 19. Among his things, I found a leather-bound sketchbook I'd never seen before. Inside were designs, furniture mainly, drawn with the precision and attention to detail that characterized everything my father made. But what struck me most were the margins, filled with notes in his careful handwriting. Ideas, improvements, questions to himself. On one page, he had sketched the joinery technique that would later become his patent, the one Eloise's company had used and underpaid him for. In the margin, he'd written, "Could revolutionize custom furniture. Need to protect this one." He had known its value. He had tried to protect it, and in the end, he had begun to fight for what was rightfully his. That night, I sat on my living room floor surrounded by his sketches and wept, not just for his loss, but for the realization that I hadn't really known this side of him. The quiet woodworker I knew had also been an innovator, someone who understood his own worth even if he didn't broadcast it. The discovery shifted something fundamental in how I saw him, and by extension, myself. The next morning, I called Gerald Matthews again. "Tell me more about the patent," I said. "Tell me everything." Over the next several weeks, I immersed myself in understanding my father's work in a way I never had while he was alive. Gerald provided copies of the patent documents, the licensing agreement with Maison Laurent Furniture, the correspondence between their legal team and my father. I spread these papers across my dining table and studied them every evening after school, learning the language of contracts and royalties, of intellectual property and breach of agreement. Diana Winters became a regular visitor, bringing not just evidence but stories about the industry, about Eloise's rise to power, about others who had been stepped on along the way. She would sit at my table, elegant in her simple linen clothes, and share insights that helped me understand what we were truly up against. "Eloise doesn't just want success," she told me one evening, stirring honey into her tea. "She needs to be seen as self-made, entirely original. That's why she takes such extreme measures to erase contributions from others. It threatens the narrative she's built." "But why my father?" I asked. "His joinery technique was brilliant, but it was just one element of her furniture line." Diana's smile was sad but knowing, because it was the linchpin. That technique allowed for the distinctive look that put Maison Laurent on the map, the seamless joints, the curves that seem impossible. Without it, they would have been just another luxury furniture brand. With it, they became revolutionary. This revelation shifted my understanding of the case. This wasn't just about money owed, it was about credit stolen, about erasing my father's genius to bolster Eloise's legend. The injustice of it burned in me, a steady flame replacing the fog of grief. As the lawsuit progressed, my life developed a new rhythm. Mornings in the classroom, teaching art to pre-teens whose drama and energy kept me anchored in the present. Afternoons meeting with Gerald, reviewing documents, preparing for depositions. Evenings researching furniture design, learning the terminology, studying the market so I could speak about my father's contribution with authority. I started keeping a journal, something I hadn't done since high school. Not because I had grandiose notions of publishing my story someday, but because I needed to track my own transformation. Some entries were angry, raw, unfiltered rage at Eloise, at a system that allowed the powerful to exploit the less powerful, at myself for taking so long to stand up. Others were frightened, doubts about whether I could see this through, fears about public exposure, anxiety about the financial risk. But slowly, other emotions began to appear on those pages. Pride in small victories, gratitude for unexpected allies, and most surprisingly, a growing sense of purpose that extended beyond the lawsuit itself. One Tuesday in April, about 4 months after filing the lawsuit, I arrived at school to find a local newspaper on my desk, folded open to a business section article about the case. My stomach dropped. I had been trying to keep my professional life separate from the legal battle, not wanting it to distract from my teaching or make my students uncomfortable. The sticky note attached simply read, "We're proud of you." The staff. Throughout the day, colleagues stopped by my classroom to offer quiet words of support. The school principal, Dr. Rivera, called me into her office during my planning period. "Rebecca," she said, her tone serious but kind, "I want you to know that the school stands behind you. What you're doing takes courage, and it's exactly what we try to teach our students, to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." I hadn't realized how much I needed that validation until the tears came, unexpected and uncontrollable. Dr. Rivera pushed a box of tissues across her desk and waited patiently while I composed myself. "I'm sorry," I said automatically, then caught myself, the old habit of apologizing for having emotions. "Actually, no, I'm not sorry. Thank you for your support. It means more than I can say." She smiled. "There's something else. Several parents have reached out asking if you would consider speaking to the 8th grade girls about your experience. Not the legal details, of course, but about finding your voice, standing up to intimidation. The timing works well with their unit on women's history." The request startled me. Me? I'm still in the middle of this. I don't know if I'm the right person to— "Rebecca," she interrupted gently, "who better? You're living it. You're showing them what courage looks like in real time." I left her office with a mix of terror and something approaching pride. The idea that my struggle could have meaning beyond my own vindication, that it could possibly help shape these young women's understanding of their own worth. It was both overwhelming and oddly clarifying. The following week, I stood before 30 8th grade girls in the school library, my hands trembling slightly as I held my notes. I had prepared carefully, wanting to be honest without sharing inappropriate details, inspirational without being trite. "I'm not going to tell you that standing up for yourself is easy," I began. "It's not. Sometimes it's the hardest thing you'll ever do. Sometimes it means being uncomfortable, being criticized, being afraid." I looked at their young faces, so open and unformed, still at an age where they could go either way, toward self-advocacy or toward the kind of self-erasure I had practiced for decades. "But I will tell you this. Every time you stay silent when you should speak, every time you make yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable, every time you accept less than you deserve, you lose a piece of yourself. And eventually, those pieces add up to something significant." I told them about the boutique, about the mockery, about the slow awakening that followed. I didn't name Eloise or mention the lawsuit directly, but I spoke about the importance of recognizing your own value, about how standing up once makes it easier to stand up again. "The world will try to tell you who you are," I said, my voice growing stronger. "People with more power, more money, more status will try to define your worth. Your job is to know it for yourself, to hold on to it when others try to take it away." After the talk, a girl named Zoe stayed behind, twisting the end of her braid nervously. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "what if you don't know how to start? What if you've been quiet for so long that no one expects anything else from you?" Her question hit me like a physical force. It was exactly what I would have asked at her age, if I'd had the courage. You start small, I told her. You practice in safe places, with people who care about you. You write it down if speaking is too hard. You find just one person who sees you clearly and let them remind you of who you are until you can remember for yourself. She nodded, serious and thoughtful. Like you're doing now? With the thing everyone's talking about? I smiled. Something like that. But Zoe, remember, standing up for yourself isn't about becoming someone new. It's about becoming more fully who you already are. As she left, I realized I had been speaking to my younger self as much as to her. The girl I had been, the woman I was becoming. We were having a conversation across time, across experience, each teaching the other something essential about resilience. The lawsuit continued its slow, grinding progress through the legal system. Eloise's team employed every delay tactic possible, filing motions to dismiss, requesting extensions, challenging the validity of evidence. Each setback was frustrating, but I was learning to take the long view. Time was actually on our side. Diana's documents were solid, and each delay allowed Gerald to build an even stronger case. What I wasn't prepared for was the personal cost. The constant stress began to manifest physically, tension headaches that lasted for days, insomnia that left me foggy in the classroom, a persistent knot in my stomach that no amount of tea or meditation seemed to untangle. My friends, though supportive at first, grew tired of every conversation circling back to the case. Some stopped calling altogether. Then came the public attacks. As the lawsuit gained more attention, Eloise's PR team shifted strategies, moving from dismissing the case as frivolous to actively working to discredit me. A piece appeared in a local lifestyle magazine painting me as unstable, suggesting I had fabricated the boutique incident out of resentment for not being able to afford luxury goods. The worst came 6 months into the lawsuit, a carefully orchestrated exposé featuring interviews with former colleagues and acquaintances who portrayed me as attention-seeking and unreliable. Most painful was a quote from Marissa, who had been my closest friend in college. Becca always had a victim mentality. She'd twist situations to make herself the wronged party. I'm not surprised she's doing this now. I hadn't spoken to Marissa in years, not since a falling out over her boyfriend's inappropriate behavior at a party, behavior she had defended while suggesting I was overreacting. Reading her words reopened that old wound while creating a fresh one. That night I called Diana, nearly hyperventilating with hurt and rage. I can't do this, I sobbed into the phone. They're turning everyone against me. They're making me sound crazy. Diana's voice was steady, a counterpoint to my panic. Listen to me, Rebecca. This is exactly what they want. To break you down so you'll take a lowball settlement just to make it stop. This is how Eloise operates. She used the same tactics against me 30 years ago. But the things they're saying are calculated to hurt you where you're most vulnerable, she finished. That's why they found Marissa. That's why they're focusing on making you seem unstable rather than addressing the actual evidence. She was right, of course. This was a strategy, not a coincidence. Still, knowing the purpose didn't lessen the pain. How did you survive it? I asked, my voice small. There was a long pause before Diana answered. I didn't, not really. I took the settlement they offered. I signed the NDA. I walked away and started over somewhere else. Another pause. That's why I'm helping you, Rebecca, because I've regretted that decision every day for 30 years. Her honesty was both devastating and clarifying. I could give in, take whatever they offered, try to rebuild my reputation quietly, but at what cost to my self-respect? To the example I was trying to set for my students? To the legacy of my father's work? The next day, I did something I had never done before. I called in sick to school, drove to a salon I'd never visited, and asked the stylist to cut my long, brown hair into a short modern bob. As the locks fell to the floor, I felt a strange lightening, as if I were physically shedding the weight of others' expectations. "Color too?" the stylist asked, gathering the fallen strands. "Yes," I said, surprising myself. "Something bold." I left with hair that fell just below my ears, the front streaked with a vibrant teal that caught the light when I moved. It was nothing like the careful, conventional style I'd worn for years, the one designed to help me blend in, to be taken seriously as a teacher. When I walked into school the following day, the reaction was immediate. Students stared, whispered excitedly. Teachers did double takes. Dr. Rivera passed me in the hallway, stopped, then simply said, "It suits you." It was a small act of rebellion, hardly revolutionary, but it was a visible declaration that I was no longer interested in making myself palatable to those who would diminish me. It was armor against the public attacks, a way of saying, "You don't get to define me." The hair was just the beginning. I started speaking differently too, more directly, without the qualifiers and apologies that had cluttered my language for years. I redecorated my apartment, replacing the neutral tones with vibrant colors that had always attracted me, but that I'd deemed too much. I enrolled in a woodworking class at the community center, determined to understand my father's craft from the inside out. These changes weren't just cosmetic, they were reclamations. Each one a statement. This is who I am when I'm not afraid. This is who I've always been beneath the careful exterior. Not everyone approved. My mother, during our weekly phone calls from her retirement community in Florida, was particularly disturbed by the hair. "Rebecca, what were you thinking? You had such beautiful long hair. And teal? At your age?" "I like it, Mom," I said simply. "It makes me happy." "Well, it's not very professional. What must your students' parents think?" In the past, this would have sent me into a spiral of doubt. Now, I found myself smiling. Actually, 3 mothers have asked for my stylist's information, and the 8th grade girls have started a petition to allow colored hair in the dress code. The lawsuit entered its 2nd year. Eloise's team, seeing that their intimidation tactics weren't working, shifted again. This time attempting to drag my father's reputation into question, suggesting he had stolen the joinery technique from a European craftsman during a trip abroad. It was a desperate move and easily disproven. Dad had meticulously documented his design process in those sketchbooks I'd found, dating back years before the European craftsman had published anything similar. The accusation was dismissed, but it revealed the lengths to which Eloise would go rather than simply pay what was owed. As the case moved closer to trial, the settlement offers increased, first $500,000, then $750,000. Each time, Gerald would call, explaining the pros and cons of accepting versus continuing the fight. "The money would set you up nicely," he said after the $750,000 offer. "And it would be over. You could move on with your life." I considered it seriously. The strain was taking a toll. My teaching was suffering. I was distracted, running on too little sleep. The legal fees were mounting, though Gerald had agreed to take most of his payment from the eventual settlement. And the continuing public scrutiny was exhausting. But each time I was tempted to settle, I would return to my father's workshop, now cleared out and sold to another craftsman, but still holding the echo of his presence. I would run my hands over the workbench where he had created beauty from raw wood, where he had developed the technique that others had exploited. And I would remember what this fight was really about. Not just money, but recognition, justice, truth. "No," I told Gerald. "Not yet. Not for less than what's fair." The decision to continue came with its own kind of peace, the clarity that comes from knowing you're acting in alignment with your deepest values, regardless of the outcome. I began sleeping better, found my focus returning in the classroom. The case was still there, still demanding attention, but it no longer consumed me. I had other identities now: teacher, woodworker in training, advocate, speaker. The lawsuit was just one part of a life that was expanding in ways I hadn't anticipated. One Saturday morning, I was at the community center, working on a small jewelry box, my first solo project after months of instruction. I was focused on routing the edges, the wood dust clinging to my safety glasses, when I heard a familiar voice. "Ms. Mitchell?" I looked up to see Zoe, the 8th grader who had stayed after my talk months earlier. She was standing with a woman who had to be her mother. They shared the same wide-set eyes and determined chin. "Zoe, hello," I said, turning off the router and pushing my glasses up. "Are you taking a class here?" She nodded, gesturing to the pottery studio across the hall. "Mom signed us up together, but I saw you through the window and wanted to say hi." She hesitated, then added, "And to tell you that I did it." "What?" We talked about, standing up for myself. Her mother stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Lisa, Zoe's mom. I've been wanting to thank you. After your talk, Zoe finally told me about the bullying she'd been experiencing. We were able to address it with the school before it got worse." I shook her hand, then looked at Zoe with genuine pride. That took courage. Zoe shrugged, but her smile was unmistakable. "I remembered what you said about starting small. It wasn't easy, but it got easier after the first time." As they turned to leave for their pottery class, Lisa paused. "By the way, we're all following your case. The other parents, I mean. Most of us have had our run-ins with that woman or her staff. What you're doing matters to more people than you probably realize." Her words stayed with me as I finished the jewelry box, sanding the edges until they were smooth as silk, applying the finish that brought out the warm grain of the cherry wood. What you're doing matters. It was a perspective I hadn't fully considered. That, my private battle might have public meaning, might be part of a larger reckoning. That evening, as I placed the completed box on my mantle, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in me. I was no longer fighting just for my father, or even just for myself. I was fighting for Zoe, for her mother, for all the people who had been diminished by those with more power, more money, more social capital. I was fighting because sometimes the act of standing up is as important as the outcome. And in that moment, I felt truly alive, perhaps for the first time. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning in October, nearly 18 months after the lawsuit began. I was in my classroom before school, arranging supplies for the day's lesson on perspective drawing, when my phone lit up with Gerald's name. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard before. "The judge has ruled on our motion to compel discovery. Eloise's team has to turn over their internal financial records, all of them, including the offshore accounts." My hands stilled on the stack of drawing paper. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means they can no longer hide how they've been moving money around to conceal profits from your father's patent. It means we finally get to see the real numbers." There was a satisfaction in his tone that bordered on glee. "And Rebecca, based on what Diana has told us about their accounting practices, those numbers are likely to be much bigger than what we've been claiming." I leaned against my desk, absorbing the implications. "So, this is good news." "It's excellent news. It's game-changing. They have 20 days to comply, and I suspect we'll be getting a much more substantial settlement offer well before then. They do not want these records made public." The prediction proved accurate. 3 days later, Gerald called again, this time while I was grocery shopping. I abandoned my cart in the cereal aisle to step outside where I could hear him clearly. "They've offered under $4 million, he said without preamble. The number hung between us, almost absurd in its magnitude. More money than I had ever expected to see in my lifetime. Enough to completely transform my financial reality. "Is it fair?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Is it what's really owed? Gerald hesitated. It's closer. Based on our preliminary estimates, the actual underpayment plus interest would be closer to $8 million. But Rebecca, $4 million is life-changing money, and it would come without the risk and stress of a trial. I closed my eyes, feeling the autumn sun warm on my face, trying to center myself amid the swirl of emotions. Can I think about it? Of course. Take the weekend, but they want an answer by Monday. That weekend became a personal retreat. I turned off my phone, canceled my usual plans, and created space to truly consider what I wanted. Not just financially, but spiritually, emotionally. I spent Saturday morning at my father's grave, sitting on the still green grass beside his headstone, talking to him as if he could hear me. I wish you had told me, I said softly. About the patent. About what it meant to you, about how they were cheating you. I wish we had fought this together. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and distant traffic. No answer came, of course, but sitting there, I felt a clarity beginning to form. My father had valued craftsmanship above all else, the integrity of well-made things, the honesty of good work. He would have wanted full recognition, fair compensation. Nothing more, but certainly nothing less. Saturday evening, I drove to the small chapel where my parents had been married 40 years earlier. It wasn't my usual place of worship. I wasn't particularly religious, but I needed a sacred space, somewhere to connect with something larger than myself. The chapel was empty when I arrived, its simple wooden pews gleaming in the last light filtering through stained glass. I sat in the back row, not praying exactly, but opening myself to wisdom beyond my own limited perspective. What did I truly want from this lawsuit? The money, yes. It represented security, opportunity, justice. But there was something else. Something I had only begun to articulate to myself. I wanted the truth to be public. I wanted Eloise's exploitation of my father, and by extension, her exploitation of countless others, to be known. I wanted accountability, not just compensation. Taking the settlement would bring financial resolution, but would likely come with a confidentiality agreement, burying the full story under legal silence. Was that enough? Could I live with that compromise? By Sunday night, I had made my decision. I called Gerald first thing Monday morning. I want to counter, I said, my voice steady. Full amount, $18 million, plus public acknowledgement of my father's contribution to their furniture line, and no confidentiality clause. Gerald's sharp intake of breath was audible. Rebecca, that's aggressive. The public acknowledgement alone might be a deal-breaker for them. And refusing a confidentiality agreement? That's practically unheard of in these settlements. Those are my terms, I said simply. This isn't just about the money anymore. They'll likely refuse. Then we go to trial. There was a long pause before Gerald spoke again, his tone shifting from caution to something like respect. I'll convey your counteroffer today, and Rebecca, for what it's worth, I think your father would be proud. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended state. I taught my classes, attended faculty meetings, graded projects, all while carrying the knowledge that somewhere in Boston, powerful people in expensive suits were deciding whether to meet my demands or take their chances in court. On the surface, nothing in my daily life had changed. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer defined by fear, of Eloise, of public opinion, of financial insecurity. Whatever came next, I had found my voice, and I wasn't going to lose it again. The answer came on a Friday afternoon as I was washing paintbrushes at the classroom sink. Gerald's call was brief. They've accepted. All of it. We sign next week. I stood frozen, water running over my hands, unable to form words. "Rebecca? Are you there?" "Yes," I managed finally. I didn't expect them to agree." "Neither did I," Gerald admitted. "But it turns out those financial records held even more damaging information than we anticipated. The joinery patent wasn't the only thing they were hiding money on. They're cutting their losses before more comes to light." I turned off the water, dried my hands mechanically. "So, it's over?" "Almost. We still need to hammer out the precise language of the acknowledgement. But essentially, yes. You've won." I had won. The words should have brought elation. But what I felt instead was something quieter, a deep, steady satisfaction combined with a strange sense of loss. This battle had defined me for so long. Its conclusion would require a new definition of myself. "Thank you, Gerald," I said. "For everything." "Don't thank me yet. The real work begins when the money arrives and you have to figure out what to do with it." He was right, though I didn't fully appreciate it at the time. The settlement process took another month. Paperwork to sign, terms to finalize, accounts to establish. Through it all, I continued teaching, continued my woodworking classes, continued the quiet rituals of my everyday life, knowing they were about to change in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. The public acknowledgement came first, a press release from Maison Laurent Furniture announcing a clarification regarding their signature joinery technique, crediting my father as the original inventor and patent holder. It was carefully worded, legally vetted, but unmistakable in its meaning. Eloise's company had built its reputation on someone else's innovation. The story was picked up by industry publications, then by local news, eventually making its way to national business outlets. The narrative focused primarily on the company's decision to properly credit all contributors to their designs, avoiding direct mention of the lawsuit or settlement amount. But those who could read between the lines understood what had happened. The money arrived on a Tuesday, a staggering sum appearing in a newly established account, transforming me overnight from a teacher living paycheck to a woman of means. The unreality of it was disorienting. I printed the bank statement and stared at it for a long time, trying to connect the number on the page with my actual life. That evening, as I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by financial planning brochures Gerald had provided, there was a knock at my apartment door. I opened it to find Diana standing there, a bottle of champagne in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. "I thought you might need this," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The first night after the money hits is always the strangest. She poured us each a glass, then raised hers in a toast. To Arthur Mitchell, woodworker extraordinaire, and to his daughter, who finished what he started. We clinked glasses, the sound crystalline in my quiet apartment. "How are you feeling?" Diana asked, settling onto my couch. I considered the question carefully. Grateful, vindicated, a little lost. She nodded. "That's normal. You've been in battle mode for so long, peace takes some getting used to. Did you feel this way after you settled with Eloise all those years ago?" Diana's smile turned wistful. "My situation was different. I took their offer because I was scared and tired. I didn't fight for the full recognition you did. So alongside the relief, I felt compromised." She took a sip of champagne. "That's why watching you win so completely has been healing for me too." We talked late into the night, about the case, about my father, about what comes after victory. Diana shared her own journey after leaving the fashion industry, how she had reinvented herself as an advocate for ethical business practices, working behind the scenes to support others who had been exploited by powerful corporations. "The money gives you options," she said as she was leaving. "But it's what you do with those options that will define this next chapter." Her words stayed with me as I navigated the strange new territory of financial security. The first decision was easy. I paid off my student loans and the small credit card debt I'd accumulated during the leaner months of the lawsuit. The second was equally clear. I established a scholarship fund in my father's name for students pursuing crafts and trades with a focus on innovation and ethical business practices. The harder decisions came next. Should I continue teaching? Buy a house? Invest in further education for myself? The possibilities were simultaneously liberating and paralyzing. I sought guidance from a financial advisor recommended by Gerald, a no-nonsense woman named Priya, who specialized in helping people manage unexpected windfalls. The mistake most people make, she told me during our first meeting, is changing everything at once, or alternatively, changing nothing because they're overwhelmed by options. Which am I at risk for? I asked. She studied me thoughtfully. Based on our conversation so far, I'd say you're at risk for the second. You've been in survival mode for so long that abundance feels suspicious. You're afraid to fully claim this new reality. Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Despite the money in my account, I was still shopping at discount stores, still hesitating to turn up the heat in my apartment, still making coffee at home instead of occasionally treating myself to a cafe latte. Old habits of scarcity were hard to break. Here's what I suggest, Priya continued. Make one meaningful change right away, something that improves your daily life but doesn't require you to completely reimagine your identity. Then give yourself permission to take 6 months before making any other major decisions. That weekend, I followed her advice and bought a small house, not a mansion, not even a particularly large home, but a charming 2-bedroom craftsman, with a detached garage perfect for converting into a woodworking studio. It was in a quiet neighborhood not far from my school, with a small yard and a front porch where I could imagine sitting with morning coffee. The process of making it mine, painting the walls colors I loved, furnishing it with pieces that brought me joy rather than just served a function, setting up the garage with quality tools that would have made my father whistle in appreciation, became a kind of therapy. Each decision was an affirmation. This is who I am now. This is what I value. This is the life I'm choosing. 3 months after moving in, I invited my 8th grade art students to help me paint a mural on the studio wall, a sprawling tree with branches that held small symbols representing different woodworking traditions from around the world. As we worked together, music playing, paint splattering on the drop cloths, I felt a contentment that went beyond the settlement, beyond vindication. "Ms. Mitchell," asked Lily, one of my quieter students, as she carefully detailed a Celtic knotwork pattern on one branch, "are you going to quit teaching now that you're rich?" The question made me pause, brush mid-stroke. It was something I'd been contemplating, especially as the demands of maintaining both teaching and my growing interest in woodworking pulled me in different directions. "I'm not sure yet," I answered, honestly. "But if I do, it won't be because of the money. It will be because I'm following a different calling." She nodded, serious beyond her years. "My mom says you're the best art teacher the school's ever had. She says you really see us." Her words touched something deep inside me. To be seen? Wasn't that what I had been fighting for all along? Not just for my father's legacy, but for myself? And now this child was telling me that I had given that same gift to my students. That evening, after the students had gone home and I was cleaning dried paint from my hands, I made a decision. I would finish out the school year, give my students the continuity they deserved, but then I would step away from classroom teaching to pursue a new path combining woodworking, advocacy, and education in a different form. The following week, I scheduled a meeting with Dr. Rivera to give her the news. To my surprise, she wasn't shocked. "I've seen this coming," she said, smiling warmly. "Not because of the money, but because you've outgrown these walls. You have more to offer now than what a traditional classroom can contain." "I'm not sure exactly what I'll do next," I admitted. "You don't need to know yet, but I have a feeling it will involve continuing to teach, just in a different way." She leaned forward, her expression serious. Before you go, though, there's something I'd like you to consider. Would you be willing to speak at graduation? The 8th graders specifically requested you. The request was unexpected and deeply moving. I'd be honored. In the months that followed, as I prepared for this transition, news of Eloise's troubles continued to emerge. The scrutiny brought by our case had opened floodgates. Other designers, craftspeople, and former employees came forward with their own stories of exploitation and credit stealing. Her company's stock continued to fall. High-end retailers began distancing themselves from her brand. The tax fraud investigation was proceeding separately, with new charges added as more financial improprieties came to light. The fashion icon who had once seemed untouchable was witnessing the collapse of her carefully constructed empire. I took no pleasure in her downfall. That surprised some people who expected me to gloat. But what I felt instead was a somber satisfaction. That truth was finally prevailing. That accountability was possible even for those who had operated with impunity for decades. My own focus turned increasingly toward the future. I enrolled in an intensive furniture-making program at a renowned craft school, spending weekends learning techniques that built upon my father's foundation. I began designing my own pieces, simple, at first, then increasingly complex as my skills developed. To my surprise, there was interest in my work, not just from friends and colleagues, but from galleries and small boutiques that appreciated the story behind the pieces. I wasn't becoming rich from woodworking. The settlement had already taken care of financial concerns, but I was building a reputation for thoughtful, ethically created furniture that honored traditional techniques while incorporating contemporary design. The graduation ceremony fell on a perfect June day, sunshine spilling across the school auditorium as 8th graders fidgeted in their formal clothes, parents beamed from the audience, and teachers tried to maintain order amid the controlled chaos. When Dr. Rivera introduced me, the applause was warm, punctuated by a few enthusiastic whoops from students who had connected with my story. I approached the podium, looking out at the young faces, some excited, some bored, all on the cusp of transition to high school and the wider world beyond. The speech I had prepared suddenly felt inadequate. I set my notes aside and spoke from the heart. 2 years ago, I walked into a boutique to buy a dress for my father's funeral, I began. What happened there, being mocked, being dismissed, could have been just another painful memory in a difficult time. Instead, it became the first step on a journey I never expected to take. I told them about finding my voice, about standing up against intimidation, about discovering strength I didn't know I possessed. I didn't mention Eloise by name or delve into the legal details, but I spoke honestly about the cost of speaking truth to power and the greater cost of staying silent. The world will try to tell you who you are, I said, echoing words I had shared with them months earlier. It will try to define your worth based on what you own, how you look, who you know. Sometimes it will even try to convince you that you're already dead, that your dreams, your voice, your unique contributions don't matter. I paused, making eye contact with Zoe, with Lily, with each student who had shared part of this journey with me. When that happens, and it will happen, remember this. You get to decide who you are. Not the bullies, not the critics, not even the people who love you but have limited ideas about what you can become. You. The room was utterly silent now, every face turned toward me. Choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. It's how you become fully alive. It's how you contribute your unique gifts to a world that desperately needs them. I smiled, feeling the truth of my own words settle into my bones. And trust me, fully alive is the best way to be. The applause that followed wasn't polite or perfunctory. It was genuine, heartfelt, a wave of sound that washed over me with unexpected force. As I returned to my seat, Dr. Rivera squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That," she whispered, "is exactly what they needed to hear." Later, as students and parents mingled at the reception, a woman approached me, elegantly dressed, with a familiar, determined chin. "Lisa, Zoe's mother." "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for what you did for Zoe, but for what you've done for all of us, standing up to Eloise Laurent. It matters. She's hurt so many people, made so many of us feel small." I realized with a start that Lisa must work in the fashion industry, perhaps had even worked for Eloise directly. "The lawsuit wasn't just about money," I said. "I know." She smiled. "That's what makes it so powerful. You didn't just win compensation. You broke a silence that's protected her for decades." As graduation day faded into summer, I settled into a new rhythm. Mornings in the workshop. Afternoons meeting with a small group of women who wanted to learn woodworking. Evenings planning what would eventually become the Mitchell Center for Craft and Entrepreneurship. A place where artisans could learn not just technical skills, but how to protect and value their creative work. One humid July evening, as I sat on my front porch watching fireflies rise from the grass, my phone buzzed with a news alert. "Fashion mogul Eloise Laurent pleads guilty to tax fraud. Faces possible. Prison time." I set the phone aside, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that cycles complete themselves, that actions eventually yield consequences, that justice, while imperfect and often delayed, does sometimes arrive. The real victory wasn't Eloise's downfall. It was my uprising, from a woman who apologized for existing to one who stood firmly in her own worth, from someone who had been told she looked dead already to someone vibrantly, unapologetically alive. The breeze carried the scent of fresh cut wood from my workshop, where a rocking chair was taking shape under my hands, a gift for Diana, whose courage and guidance had helped make all of this possible. Tomorrow, I would continue working on it, shaping the curves, sanding the joints to perfect smoothness, applying finish that would bring out the natural beauty of the grain. Tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, would be shaped by the same truth I had shared with my students. I got to decide who I was. Not the past, not other people's expectations, not even the settlement that had changed my financial reality. Just me, fully alive, creating beauty from raw materials, in wood, in community, in myself. 3 years after the settlement, on a crisp autumn morning, I stood at the entrance of the Mitchell Center for Craft and Entrepreneurship, watching as the first group of students arrived. The converted warehouse space in downtown Boston gleamed with natural light streaming through newly installed skylights, illuminating workbenches made from reclaimed oak, shelves lined with tools both antique and state-of-the-art, and walls adorned with examples of master craftsmanship from diverse traditions. This moment represented the culmination of so much: my father's legacy, my own transformation, and a vision born from both triumph and struggle. As the students entered, their expressions mirrored my own emotions 3 years earlier when the settlement had first hit my bank account, a mixture of excitement, intimidation, and possibility. "Welcome to the first session of the Artisan's Path program," I said, my voice steady and clear in the high-ceilinged space. "My name is Becca Mitchell, and I believe that creating with your hands can change not just objects, but lives, including your own." The group was deliberately diverse: woodworkers, metalsmiths, textile artists, ceramicists, ranging in age from 22 to 76. Some were established in their crafts, but struggling with the business aspects. Others were talented beginners seeking mentorship. All had been selected for both skill and need, with full scholarships provided to those from underrepresented communities or difficult financial circumstances. "Over the next 6 months," I continued, "you'll deepen your technical skills, certainly. But you'll also learn how to protect your creative work, how to value it appropriately, how to build sustainable businesses around your craft without compromising your artistic integrity. I moved among the workbenches, making eye contact with each participant. Most importantly, you'll learn to see yourselves as I see you, not just as makers of beautiful things, but as keepers of knowledge that deserves respect, recognition, and fair compensation. Later that evening, after the students had departed, and I was locking up the building, my phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Saw the coverage of your opening day. Arthur would be bursting with pride. So am I. I smiled, pocketing the phone as I walked to my car. Diana had become family these past years. Mentor, friend, occasional reality check when my ambitions outpaced practical considerations. Her support had been invaluable as I navigated the transition from classroom teacher to founder and director of the center. The drive home took me past the site of Eloise Laurent's former flagship boutique on Newbury Street, now transformed into a cooperative gallery showcasing work by local designers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Spaces, like people, could be reinvented when old structures collapsed. Eloise herself had served 11 months in a minimum security prison after pleading guilty to tax fraud. Upon release, she had retreated from public life, reportedly moving to a small town in Vermont. I heard occasionally that she was attempting to rebuild a smaller, more ethical business focused on sustainable fashion, though these rumors remained unverified. I harbored no ill will toward her now. The woman who had mocked my funeral dress had inadvertently set me on a path to fuller life. In some strange way, I owed her a debt I would never acknowledge directly, but honored through my work with others who had been underestimated or exploited. At home, I changed into comfortable clothes and made my way to the studio, where my current project awaited, a writing desk commissioned by Zoe, now in her first year of college, studying journalism with a focus on corporate accountability. The irony made me smile every time I worked on it. As I ran my hands over the half-completed piece, feeling the smooth curves where I had shaped the wood to follow its natural grain, I reflected on how profoundly my relationship with my father's craft had evolved. What had begun as a way to understand his legacy had become my own form of expression, my own path to connecting with something larger than myself. The Mitchell Center was the most visible manifestation of the settlement's impact, but there were quieter transformations too. I had established a legal aid fund for craftspeople and artists facing intellectual property disputes. I had helped Diana launch a certification program for ethical business practices in the luxury goods industry. I had even written a book, part memoir, part guide to valuing creative work, that had found an unexpected audience among women reclaiming their power in midlife. None of these achievements would have seemed possible to the woman who once stood, humiliated in a boutique, who had been told she looked dead already. That version of me couldn't have imagined the life I now lived, not because of financial resources, though those certainly helped, but because of an inner certainty that had been forged through conflict and vindication. The following morning, I arrived at the center early to prepare for a special event, a workshop on legal protections for artisans, co-taught with Gerald, who had become a passionate advocate for creative rights after our case together. As I arranged chairs in the conference room, I heard the front door open. "Hello?" called a hesitant voice. "Is Rebecca Mitchell available?" I stepped into the main workspace to find a woman in her early 30s, clutching a portfolio case, her expression a mixture of nervousness and determination that felt immediately familiar. "I'm Rebecca," I said, extending my hand. "The workshop doesn't start for another hour, but you're welcome to wait." "Oh, I'm not here for the workshop," she said, shaking my hand firmly despite her apparent anxiety. "My name is Mia Santos. I was hoping to speak with you about a situation I'm facing." Something in her tone, a controlled tension, a careful choosing of words, told me this wasn't a casual visit. I invited her into my office, a small but warm space with large windows overlooking the city and walls lined with books on craftsmanship, business ethics, and art history. Mia sat at the edge of her chair, opened her portfolio, and began to tell her story. She was a jewelry designer whose distinctive metalwork technique had been appropriated by a major luxury brand. She had documentation proving her technique predated. Their use of it had attempted to address it directly with the company, had been dismissed and then threatened with countersuits if she pursued the matter. "I know I should just let it go," she said, her voice catching slightly. "They have teams of lawyers. I'm just one person with a small studio and dwindling savings. But this technique took me years to develop. It's not just about money. It's my artistic identity they've taken." As she spoke, I was struck by the echoes of my own experience. Not just the facts of the case, but the emotional toll of being dismissed, of having one's creative contribution devalued. The familiar mix of anger, helplessness, and determination in her eyes reflected what I had felt years earlier. When she finished, I didn't immediately offer solutions or empty reassurances. Instead, I asked a question that had once been asked of me. "What do you want, Mia? Not what you think is realistic or practical. What do you truly want from this situation?" She blinked, clearly surprised by the directness of the question. Most people in my position, I knew, would have started by explaining limitations, tempering expectations. But I had learned the value of beginning with honest desire rather than preemptive compromise. "I want them to stop using my technique without permission," she said slowly. "I want credit for creating it, and I want fair compensation for what they've already sold using my work." I nodded. "Those are reasonable wants, not easy to achieve against a powerful company, but reasonable and specific. That's a good starting point." "Do you think I have a chance?" she asked, a fragile hope edging into her voice. "I think," I said carefully, "that you have a legitimate claim worth pursuing, and I think you came to the right place." I reached for my phone. "Let me call Gerald Matthews. If he sees merit in your case, the Mitchell Legal Aid Fund would cover his fees." The look on Mia's face, shock giving way to tentative relief, reminded me of what true empowerment feels like. Not just standing up for yourself, but having someone stand beside you, someone who has walked the path before and can help navigate its twists and turns. As I made the call, arranging for Gerald to meet us after the workshop, I realized how far I had come from that day in the boutique. I had moved from being the one who needed help to being the one who could offer it. From the one silenced to the one amplifying others' voices. The settlement had provided financial means, certainly, but this deeper transformation had come from something money couldn't buy, the reclamation of my own value and the commitment to helping others do the same. Gerald arrived early for the workshop, giving him time to review Mia's documentation. His expression grew increasingly animated as he examined her portfolio, technical drawings, and correspondence with the company. "This is solid," he said finally, looking up at Mia with the same focused intensity I remembered from our first meeting years ago. "Better documentation than most cases I see. We would need to gather more evidence about their sales volumes to calculate damages, but the foundation for a claim is strong." Mia's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her materials. "What would this cost?" she asked, the practical question revealing her limited resources. Gerald glanced at me, and I nodded confirmation. "The Mitchell Fund would cover legal expenses," he explained. "If we win, a percentage of any settlement would go back into the fund to help others in similar situations. If we don't win, you owe nothing." "Why would you do this for me?" Mia asked, looking between us with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion that spoke volumes about her previous experiences seeking help. "Because 3 years ago, I was sitting where you are," I said simply. "And someone believed in my case when I wasn't sure I believed in it myself." The workshop that followed was one of our most successful, with artisans from various disciplines engaging deeply with questions of intellectual property, contract negotiation, and ethical business practices. Watching Gerald explain complex legal concepts in accessible language, seeing the participants gradually shift from intimidated to empowered, I felt a profound satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. This, creating spaces where craft was valued, where makers understood their rights, where the exploitative practices I had fought against were being systematically dismantled, was the true victory. Far more meaningful than the settlement amount, more lasting than the public acknowledgement of my father's contribution, this ongoing work of transformation represented the legacy I wanted to build. After the workshop, as participants lingered to ask questions and exchange contact information, I noticed a familiar figure entering the center. Dr. Rivera, my former principal, now retired but still a valued mentor and friend. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, embracing me warmly. "I was in the neighborhood and wanted to see this place I've heard so much about." I gave her a tour, introducing her to staff members and explaining various programs. She listened, attentively, asking insightful questions about curriculum development and student outcomes. Her educator's mind still sharp and engaged. "This is extraordinary, Rebecca," she said as we ended in my office. "But I'm not surprised. You always had this in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself." "I'm not sure that's true," I admitted, pouring us each a cup of tea. The woman I was before the lawsuit, before Eloise, I don't know if she could have envisioned any of this. Dr. Rivera's smile was gentle but knowing. The circumstances may have been the catalyst, but the capacity was always there. Some seeds just need a particular kind of storm to germinate. Her metaphor lingered with me long after she left, through the remainder of the day's activities and into the evening. As I drove home under a sky deepening to indigo, I found myself reflecting on all the storms that had shaped me. Not just the lawsuit and its very public battle, but the quiet, internal tempests that had preceded it. The grief of losing my father. The slow erosion of self-worth through years of making myself smaller. The momentary devastation of being mocked in that boutique. Each had been painful in its time. Each had felt like an ending rather than a beginning. Yet each had contributed essential elements to the person I had become. That night, I received an unexpected email that would set in motion the final chapter of my journey with Eloise Laurent. The sender was Vanessa Chen, Eloise's former assistant who had witnessed my humiliation in the boutique years earlier. The message was brief, but impactful. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been following your work with the center, and am deeply impressed by what you've created. I'm writing because Eloise Laurent has contacted me about the possibility of making amends to those she's wronged. Your name was at the top of her list. She is in poor health and seeking resolution for past actions. I understand if you want nothing to do with this, but if you're open to a conversation, please let me know. With respect, Vanessa Chen." I sat with the email for a long time, emotions cycling through me like weather systems. Anger, curiosity, wariness, and something approaching compassion. The Rebecca of 3 years ago might have deleted it immediately or responded with righteous indignation. The Rebecca of today recognized the rarity and potential value of such an opportunity. After sleeping on it, I replied simply, "I'm willing to listen. Please arrange a call at your convenience." The conversation happened the following week, not with Eloise directly, but with Vanessa as an intermediary. She explained that Eloise had been diagnosed with a progressive illness that had prompted deep reflection on her life and actions. The legal consequences of her business practices had been humbling, but it was the personal reckonings that had truly transformed her. "She remembers what she said to you that day very clearly," Vanessa said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "It was cruel, and it was part of a pattern of behavior she's now confronting honestly for the first time." "What exactly is she proposing?" I asked, neither accepting nor rejecting the overture, maintaining the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. "She would like to make a substantial donation to the Mitchell Center," Vanessa explained. "No strings attached, no public recognition required. And she would like to meet with you if you're willing, not to ask forgiveness, but to acknowledge directly the harm she caused. I considered the proposition carefully. The donation would allow us to expand our legal aid program, perhaps establish a permanent endowment to ensure its continuation beyond my lifetime. The meeting would represent a kind of closure I hadn't known I needed until it was offered. "I'll think about it," I said, neither committing nor refusing. "And Vanessa, thank you for facilitating this. I imagine it hasn't been an easy position to be in." "Actually," she said with unexpected warmth, "being part of making amends has been healing for me too. I stood by silently while Eloise hurt people. This is my way of breaking that silence." The meeting was arranged for the following month, at a neutral location, a small private room at the Boston Public Library, a place of both knowledge and beauty that seemed fitting for such a charged encounter. I arrived early, taking time to center myself amid the library's hushed grandeur, reminding myself that I was approaching this conversation from a position of strength, not vulnerability. When Eloise entered, I barely recognized her. The impeccably coiffed fashion icon had been replaced by a thin, gray-faced woman who moved with the careful deliberation of someone conserving limited energy. Her clothes were still elegant but simpler, her once sharp gaze now softened by something that looked like hard-won wisdom. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, her voice raspier than I remembered but still carrying that distinctive cultured tone. "I wasn't sure you would." 3 years ago, I wouldn't have," I replied honestly. "But I've changed since then." "So have I," she said, settling carefully into her chair. Though in my case, the changes came later and with more resistance. What followed was one of the most extraordinary conversations of my life. Not because Eloise offered dramatic apologies or I granted magnanimous forgiveness, but because of its rare and unflinching honesty. She spoke of patterns she had recognized too late, of a ruthless drive for success that had corrupted her relationships and ethics, of regrets that now kept her awake through long nights of illness. I listened without interrupting, neither absolving nor condemning, simply witnessing her reckoning with her own legacy. When she finished, I shared my own journey, not to match confessions, but to illustrate how her actions, however cruel in the moment, had catalyzed transformations neither of us could have anticipated. "The strange thing is," I said toward the end of our conversation, "in some ways I should thank you. That moment in the boutique, as painful as it was, woke something in me that might have stayed dormant otherwise." Eloise looked startled, then thoughtful. "That's more generosity than I deserve. But I understand what you mean about catalysts. Prison was mine. 11 months of stripped identity, of being nothing but a number and a uniform." She gave a wry smile. "It's clarifying, losing everything you thought defined you." Before we parted, she handed me an envelope. "The donation paperwork for your center," she said. "No public acknowledgement as agreed, but also this—" She hesitated, then continued. "A list of names. Designers, craftspeople, artists whose work I appropriated or whose contributions I minimized over the years. Some have already been contacted and compensated. Others have been harder to locate. If your legal aid fund could help with that process, it would be fitting." I accepted the envelope, recognizing the significance of what she was offering, not just financial restitution, but a map to repair harm I hadn't even known about. "I'll see that it's addressed properly." As we rose to leave, Eloise paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You said I told you that you looked dead already that day in the boutique." I nodded, the words still capable of stinging even after all this time. "The irony," she said softly, "is that you've never looked more alive than you do now, and I've never felt more diminished." "It doesn't have to be that way," I said, surprising myself with the sincerity of the offer. "The work we're doing at the center, helping people reclaim their creative rights, building ethical business models, It might interest you, given your current reflections. Something flickered in her eyes, not hope exactly, but perhaps its precursor. I doubt. I'd be welcome. Not as Eloise Laurent, fashion mogul, no, I agreed, but as someone with valuable insights into industry practices that need changing. As someone who understands both sides of exploitation and can help identify blind spots. That person might have something important to contribute. We left it there, not a commitment, but a door left slightly ajar. As I watched her walk away, moving carefully through the library's grand entrance hall, I was struck by how thoroughly our positions had reversed from that day in the boutique. Now I was the one standing tall, secure in my purpose and power, while she navigated a diminished existence shaped by consequences of her own making. Yet there was no triumph in the observation, no satisfaction in her decline. What I felt instead was a complex compassion, not absolution for her actions, but recognition of our shared humanity, our capacity for both cruelty and growth, for inflicting wounds and healing them. The donation Eloise provided established a permanent endowment for the legal aid fund, ensuring that artists and craftspeople would have access to representation for generations to come. The list of names she provided launched a project that would occupy the center for years, a systematic effort to identify and compensate creators whose contributions had been obscured or stolen by her company and others like it. 6 months after our meeting, I received word that Eloise had passed away. The news came not from public sources but from Vanessa, who had remained in contact as we worked through the list of names. She spoke of your conversation often, Vanessa wrote. It seemed to give her a peace that had eluded her for years. The final communication from Eloise arrived a week after her death. A small package containing a black dress with delicate pearl buttons, identical to the one I had tried on in her boutique years earlier. The accompanying note was brief. For moments of remembrance, may they all honor life rather than merely acknowledge death. I donated the dress to a women's organization that provided professional attire to those rebuilding their lives after hardship. It seemed the most fitting way to close the circle, to transform what had once represented humiliation into something that might offer dignity to someone else beginning their own journey of reclamation. On the 5th anniversary of the Mitchell Center's founding, we hosted a special exhibition titled Reclaimed Voices, featuring work by artisans who had been supported by our programs. The gathering included former students, legal aid recipients, workshop participants, and colleagues from across the craft and design world. As I stood addressing the crowd, I could see the constellation of lives that had been touched by what had grown from that painful moment in the boutique. Hundreds of makers who now understood their rights, dozens of businesses operating on more, ethical models, a generation of young craftspeople who were learning to value their work appropriately from the beginning. 5 years ago, I told them, someone told me I looked dead already. It was meant as an insult, a dismissal. But looking back, I think perhaps she saw something true. That part of me was dormant, waiting. What she didn't understand was that dormancy isn't death. It's potential gathering strength. I gestured to the exhibition around us, to the vibrant work created by hands that had learned to claim their power. This is what it means to be fully alive, not just to create beauty, but to ensure that creation is honored, protected, fairly compensated. Not just to find your voice, but to use it in service of others still struggling to be heard. Later, as the event wound down and guests departed, I found myself alone in the gallery, surrounded by the tangible evidence of transformation, both mine and others. I thought of my father, of his quiet dedication to craftsmanship, of Diana, whose early belief had sustained me through the hardest parts of the lawsuit, of Mia, whose case had been successfully settled, and who now taught workshops on intellectual property rights for jewelers. I thought, too, of Eloise, of how our lives had intersected at their worst moments, and yet had yielded unexpected growth, for both of us. Her cruelty had awakened my strength. My stand against her had eventually prompted her reckoning. Neither path had been easy, but both had been necessary. Outside the center, the Boston evening was settling into dusk, the skyline beginning to glitter against the darkening blue. I stood at the entrance, keys in hand, taking a moment to appreciate the fullness of the journey. From humiliation to vindication, from silence to voice, from being told I looked dead already, to creating a legacy of empowerment that would outlive me. This was what it meant to be fully, vibrantly alive. Not the absence of wounds, but their transformation into wisdom. Not the avoidance of conflict, but the courage to engage it purposefully. Not the accumulation of victories, but their expansion into opportunities for others. As I locked the door behind me and stepped into the gathering night, I carried that knowledge like a flame, not just illuminating my own path forward, but casting light for others finding their way through darkness into their own awakening. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.